Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to introduce tonight a speaker who is very near and dear to my heart. I am Dr. Jessica Clanderud, and I am the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education at Berea College. And I'm delighted to introduce our second PACE speaker of the 2021 inaugural speaker series. This is Dr. Joe William Trotter Jr. He is the Giant Eagle Professor of History and Social Justice and past History Department Chair at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also the director and founder of Carnegie Mellon Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, or CAUSE, and the president-elect of the Urban History Association. His latest publications, which he'll be speaking from this evening, are Workers on Arrival, Black Labor in the Making of America, and Pittsburgh and the Urban League Movement, A Century of Social Service and Activism from the University of Kentucky Press. Professor Trotter received his BA degree from Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Minnesota. He is currently working on a study of African American urban life since the Atlantic slave trade. Dr. Trotter also teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in African American and US urban labor and working class history. He was also my dissertation advisor and is a mentor and friend. He has delivered scholarly papers and lectures in a variety of professional forums in the United States and abroad, including institutions of higher education in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, the Netherlands, and the Middle East. He has served on the board and committee of numerous professional organizations, an executive council of the OAH, chair, nominating committee, OAH program committee, executive council, SHA, program committee, SHA, Francis B. Simpkins Prize Committee, SHA, Immigration History Society, executive board, Jameson Fellowship Committee, AHA, program committee, Oral History Association, chair of the annual program committee of the American Historical Association, and has served as a member and vice president of the board of trustees of the H. John Hines III Regional History Center, a Smithsonian affiliate, and is the past president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. So as you can see, an eminent and decorated scholar, and we are so pleased to welcome him this evening as he gives his talk on Workers on Arrival, Black Labor and the Making of America. Thank you so much, Dr. Trotter.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It's a treat to be here. And I just want to say congratulations to all the work that you are doing with the Carter G. Woodson Center. This university, Berea College, is also situated in a place not too far from where I was born in West Virginia. I was born and raised in a coal mining family in McDowell County, West Virginia. So it's always really an honor to come back to the region and to be able to talk to students and faculty about the kind of research that I do. And it's especially a treat to come back to see how well one of our alumni from Carnegie Mellon is doing. And so I will carry back the great news and on this event. Okay, and also I just want to say I appreciate Berea College's role in social justice movement over several, decades, centuries even. And so I'm very happy to be here in a place that cares about the issues that confront people of color, African American, and so on. So without further delay, let us turn to Workers on Arrival. Today, I want to give you a sense of this book and what it covers. I want to give you a sense of the themes that it covers, the time frames, the scholarship. I've given several talks on this book, but I've never taken the opportunity to try to do a brief summary of the whole thing. So today you're getting the challenge of me trying to give you the roadmap of the book as a whole. So let us begin. This study is based upon nearly a century of scholarship on African American workers and their communities. It covers a broad range of themes and issues over 4 centuries of time and space. Key themes and issues include the role of Black workers in the creation of wealth, cities, and democratic institutions, as well as their own communities and families. Workers on Arrival also responds to recent discussions of class and race in American society and politics. Following the presidential election of 2016, these debates intensified. They placed the white working class at the center of the discussion. These discussions not only largely ignored the history of Black workers, but also obscured and even distorted the work ethic of working class Black people. Many Americans, this debate reflected, believe that people of African descent have what is considered a poor work ethic. They believe that African American people, especially poor and working class people, are takers and not givers. They are consumers and not producers. They are liabilities and not assets in the development of the nation and the Americas and American democracy. My book, Workers on Arrival, seeks to counter these perceptions. It treats African Americans as key assets in the development of the United States as one of the wealthiest nations on earth. From their arrival on North American soil, Black workers, enslaved and free, helped to build and maintain American cities as well as plantations and farms. They not only worked as, quote, common laborers, household and domestic servants, they also worked as skilled craftsmen and women. Enslaved and free people of color worked in a broad range of skilled crafts. They worked as carpenters, brick masons, blacksmiths, tailors, and seamstresses, to name a few. Indeed, some scholars argue that revolutionary and early America was a kind of golden age of the Black artisan. Slaveholders encouraged enslaved Africans to learn trades. The nation's leading newspapers regularly advertised for the purchase of enslaved craftsmen and skilled needlewomen. Pre-industrial Black artisans deployed a wide range of skills and know-how. They took pride in their specialized knowledge, expertise, and tools. Some European observers describe these Black artisans as, quote, first rate and, quote, excellent. Enslaved and free people of color played a major role in the building of cities in British, French, Dutch, and Spanish urban America during the colonial era forward. But their contributions were not limited to the pre-industrial era. Black labor also fueled the rise of the United States as a predominantly urban industrial nation during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1865, the emancipation of some 4 million enslaved people set in motion the massive Great Migration of African people from rural to urban America. By the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the Great Migration started to transform African Americans into the most urbanized sector of the nation's population, so that by the late 20th century, Black people were the most urbanized sector of the nation's population. The African American urban working class had moved from the periphery to the center of the nation's Black proletariat. By the end of World War II, nearly 75% of all African Americans worked in the nation's railroad, shipbuilding, meatpacking, steel, rubber, and automobile industries. In other words, this book shows how African American labor not only fueled the development of plantation agriculture, especially cotton, tobacco, sugar, and rice. This book also shows how African American labor fueled the development of American cities, both pre industrial commercial cities and later urban industrial centers. But that's not all. This book also underscores how Black people helped to build and maintain American cities against the odds, under duress. During the pre industrial years, for example, the golden age of the Black artisan soon disappeared. Between the end of the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, an estimated 3.7 million immigrants, mostly Irish and Germans, entered the nation. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, these German and Irish immigrants pushed the Black artisan more and more to the wall. By the onset of the Civil War, the Black artisan class had dwindled to only a fraction of its former self. As free people of color lost artisan jobs, Black people worried that they were becoming, quote, a race of servants. The early 19th century Black woman, Muriel Stewart, complained, and I want to quote, slow down. She said, "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and their talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?" End of quote. Martin Delaney, a migrant from Virginia to Pittsburgh, also complained, quote, "Our fathers are their coachmen, our brothers their cookmen, and ourselves their waiting men," end of quote. The occupation of servant was not necessarily degrading, Delaney further stated, but he concluded a whole race of servants are degradation to that people, end of quote. African Americans not only lost jobs and their footing in the skilled craft, they also encountered rising levels of white hostility and violence. The American Colonization Society, formed in 1816, spearheaded a vigorous campaign to recolonize free people of color on African soil. Grassroots white intimidation and mob violence reinforced this movement. In Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Providence, Rhode Island, mobs converged on Black communities, destroying churches, businesses, and homes, and driving many Blacks out of the city. Early 19th century mobs often plundered and sold the household property of African Americans before torching the place. So this is a major thing. The first thing that I mentioned is that Black people's labor enriched this country, in the industrial and the pre-industrial period. But then the second part of this story is that they carried out all of this work of enriching the country under conditions of racial violence, discrimination, and injustice. And these injustices were not limited to the 19th century. If we fast forward to the 20th century, we can see the white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, formed after the Civil War to intimidate rural Blacks. The Klan reinvented itself as an urban phenomenon. It followed the great migration of Black people into the industrial cities of the urban North, South, and West. In August 1921, an estimated 10,000 Klansmen attended initiation ceremonies on Chicago's North Side. The Imperial Wizard traveled from Atlanta to preside over the occasion. In 1925, the Klan staged their famous national parade at the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. So the Klan became a national organization, and it became an urban organization just as the nation was escalating its engagement in industrial and manufacturing production. And it happened just as the Great Migration escalated and Black people moved into these cities in rising numbers. In the meantime, violence in the 20th century broke out in East St. Louis, Tulsa, Chicago, and other major cities. Police openly supported mob attacks on the Black community. The Chicago riot of 1919 left over 1,000 people homeless. At the same time, getting back to the police brutality and the killing of African American men and women escalated across urban America during the years of World War I and its aftermath. In Detroit, for example, in 1939, at a mass meeting at a local church, the president of Detroit's NAACP Youth Council, he told the crowd that, quote, Negroes are being shot down like rats, and unless we put up a bigger fight, such conditions will continue to exist, end of quote. One minister at that meeting urged the crowd to, quote, get mad about it, and then you will get something done, end of quote. A few years earlier, before this, the Chicago Defender had pleaded with the state's attorney general to, quote, at least investigate some of the killings committed by police officers under the guise of law enforcement. Chicago policemen, the defender further stated, believe that, quote, their badge and gun give them the right to kill citizens at will. The editors roundly condemn the policeman who patrols his beat, quote, with his finger on the trigger. Now, this is the 1930s and even earlier in the 1920s that this is happening. If we're concerned about contemporary deadly policing of African American people, we have to understand that the roots of these issues are deeply embedded in the early years of the Great Migration, and they escalated along with the movement of Black people into these cities. So in other words, Workers on Arrival documents how African Americans contributed to the development of the city and nation against the backdrop of intense discrimination, racial violence, and even bloodshed. So that's a major thing. I mean, being able to contribute against the grain of all these barriers. But that's not all either, okay? This study also underscores how African Americans also worked for themselves, even as they helped to build American cities. They also built their own families and communities. They built what I call and what historians call the Black metropolis. They launched their own independent institution building activities. And they didn't wait to do this. They did this in the early 19th century. Ordinary Black workers stood at the center of what I call the Black city building process in 1787. And just notice the occupational profile of these early Black institutions. In 1787, Boston hairdressers, cooks, and bootblacks established the Prince Hall Masonic Order. In 1794, Black Philadelphians met in a blacksmith shop and laid the foundation for the rise of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel. In Savannah, the Black Baptist Church emerged under the leadership of Andrew Bryan, a slave minister on a nearby plantation. And I could go on and on. New York, Boston, these working people of the 19th century, these so-called common laborers, as well as craftsmen, came together and forged these institutions. But it was not just the church. They also formed a variety of lucrative business enterprises. These enterprises included catering establishments, hotels, restaurants, sail-making businesses, dressmaking shops, barber shops, to name just a few. Early 19th century religious, fraternal, and entrepreneurial institutions established a foundation for the growth of the Black metropolis during the industrial age. So what the book tries to do is to bring us closer to the history of African American people during the earliest moment in the nation's history. And it tries to show that Black urban people were developing, working, and shaping the development of America from the beginning, not later, but from the beginning. Because we too often believe that Black people headed to the rice plantation, they headed to the cotton plantation, they headed to tobacco. But the truth is, as they headed to these places on the plantation, they also headed to the cities. And not only that, they helped to build the cities that became this kind of attraction for large numbers of other people. Okay, just calm down just a little bit. I get excited about these issues because I see the 19th century establishing the institutional foundation for the rise of the Black metropolis during the industrial age of the 20th century. During the 20th century, across industrial America, Black people built their own Black city, including their own Black business districts called BBDs instead of just CBDs. By the onset of World War I, vibrant Black business districts had emerged in Atlanta, Birmingham, Norfolk, Louisville, Durham, Houston, Memphis, and many other southern cities. In Atlanta, Auburn Avenue and Decatur Street emerged at the core of the city's Black metropolis. Sweet Auburn, as it was called by African Americans. Sweet Auburn housed a broad range of Black institutions, churches, fraternal orders, women's clubs, stores, nightclubs, theaters. One domestic worker later recalled, quote, "We just enjoyed Auburn Avenue. That's why you dressed up and put on good clothes and go to the show on Auburn Avenue. And you were going places," end of quote. So I want to underscore that these Black business districts emerged in the South ahead of the great migration of World War I in the 1920s. So when Southern Blacks moved to the urban industrial North and West, they carried their ideals about entrepreneurship, community, and urban development with them to Pittsburgh, Detroit, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and other cities. So these cities were not simply, quote, northern cities per se, they were southern cities in a lot of ways. Southern migrants had visions of the urban place, of the urban environment that they were able to take into the urban North and West, and they were able to leave their imprint on these 20th century northern and western cities. In Chicago, they built the famous Stroll, located on State Street in the heart of the Black Belt on Chicago's South Side. In New York, 7th Avenue became the hub of Black life in Harlem and all of New York City. In Pittsburgh, it was Wiley Avenue, and Jessica knows something about this street just up the road from Carnegie Mellon University, so to speak. Wiley Avenue was a dynamic, thriving, and bustling area dubbed the crossroads of the world. There was never a dull moment. People never went to bed. And you could say this about all these cities in the North and West that were springing up on the basis of these Southern Black people moving into these cities in rising numbers, taking jobs in industrial factories and making more money than they had experienced in their lifetime against the backdrop of Southern agriculture. So this is another theme of this book, Workers on Arrival. Even as Black people built of urban America for all kinds of other people, immigrants, American-born whites, and so on, they also built their own city within the city, their own Black Mecca, their own capital of Black America, and their own Black metropolis. So this is another theme. So when we talk about Black people and the way they were exploited to build America, we have to put into the picture that they were also saying to themselves, but we are also going to work for ourselves. We're going to build something for our families. We're going to build something for our own communities, however much we're exploited in this environment. Okay, so that's another thing. There's another one too. And the other theme is about the Black metropolis and how it was used. Black people didn't use it just to go shopping and to go to the shows at the theater and to listen to music and dance. They did all of that. Of course, the Black metropolis, it offered all of that. But they also used the Black metropolis to launch movements to abolish slavery during the 19th century and to abolish Jim Crow during the 20th century. During the early 19th century, the pre-industrial Black city served as a launching pad that helped to stymie the plans of the American Colonization Society and demolish the institution of slavery. In mass meetings, newspaper columns, pamphlets. Free wage earners of color repeatedly declared their determination to stay put in the city and in America. Here we were born, and here we will die. That is what they said over and over again, from Philadelphia to Charleston, all across this country. They were making those statements. At the same time, they built fugitive aid societies. They established vigilance committees. They established the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad networks proliferated, but ordinary Black men and women, laborers, fugitives, dock workers, household servants, artisans, and small business people, these Black people constituted the backbone of the Underground Railroad. They also accounted for some of the most daring efforts to aid the escape of enslaved people. And so there were many whites who supported the Underground Railroad. But this railroad was built on the backs of working class Black people across the South as well as in the North. During the Civil War, long before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Frederick Douglass and other African Americans urged the Union to carry the war into Africa. What they meant was go into the heart of the slave South, vigorously recruit troops among fugitive slaves and free Blacks. As Douglass put it, if you do this, you will smite the Confederacy in the very seat of its life, end of quote. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, African Americans were ready. Some 8,000 Black Pennsylvanians soon enlisted in the Union forces. In Boston by early 1863, Blacks had filled 5 companies of the 5th Massachusetts Regiment. By war's end, 500,000 Black fugitives had moved into Union lines and helped to demolish the Confederacy and liberate some 4 million enslaved people of color and people of African descent. So that's what the Black metropolis helped to do in the 19th century. Of course, they were joined by Blacks on plantation. We know about a lot more about the plantation fugitives than we know about the urban communities that organized so much of this movement. And so that's part of the story that Workers on Arrival tries to tell. But it wasn't just the 19th century. A century later, the expansion and consolidation of the Black metropolis helped to topple the white supremacist Jim Crow order. Beginning during World War II and the March on Washington movement, the modern Black freedom movement escalated during the 1950s and 1960s. It built on Black urbanization. It built on the proliferation of these Black cities within cities across the country. In 1963, the civil rights movement converged at the nation's capital during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It was this movement that produced Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. It produced new calls for freedom now, and it produced pledges that African Americans would escalate nonviolent direct action campaigns across the country until Jim Crow ceased to exist. So the Black metropolis was a key facet in this struggle. But by the mid 1960s, a variety of local, national, and international forces transformed the Black freedom movement. These forces pushed the Black Power movement to the forefront of the modern Black freedom movement. These forces included, most notably, the escalating impact of the Nation of Islam and the emergence, of course, of Malcolm X, the outbreak of violence on the streets of poor and working class Black neighborhoods across the urban North and West, as well as parts of the South. The proliferation of African independence movements, the spread of anti-war movement, and the growing militance of the white New Left movement, all of these played a role in the shift of the modern Black freedom movement to its Black Power component. I don't have a lot of time to really summarize all these movements, so I'm just going to try to state the argument that I'm making at this point. This is the argument about the role the Black metropolis played in changing the Black freedom movement, launching and changing the modern Black freedom movement, both its civil rights and Black Power iterations, demolished the Jim Crow system. I'll say that again. The modern Black freedom movement, both its civil rights and Black Power iterations, demolished the Jim Crow order. These movements gave rise to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1965, 1968, US Supreme Court cases that sanctioned affirmative action. Jim Crow, as it lived during the past, was dead. Okay? On legal front, the modern Black freedom movement demolished the legal underpinnings of that old Jim Crow order. Even if this change was short-lived, the modern Black freedom movement improved the material, social, and political position of Black workers and their communities. As sociologist Bart Landry noted, the gains of the modern Black freedom struggle reach, quote, far down into the neighborhoods and homes of the Black working class, as well as the middle class. In 1960, only 13% of all African Americans occupied what could be called middle class positions. 10 years later, the percentage nearly doubled, rising to over 25%. So we don't have time to go into all the detail, but there was a brief moment where the modern Black freedom movement did make a difference in the lives of so many African Americans. I know that scholars from my generation, many of us came from the depths of the working class, coal mining families, steel working families, meat packing families, automobile working families. And some of us got on that ladder. And we don't want to underestimate the contribution that that movement made. Okay? And the other thing, this is another theme that the book talks about, is that when Black people helped to demolish slavery and Jim Crow, they broadened the base of American democracy. They made life better for everybody, including white people. Women, for example, during the first emancipation, when Black men got to vote, it triggered a massive movement to enfranchise women, particularly white women. And we have to keep in mind that women started to get the right to vote in local, state, and national elections before the 19th Amendment at the state level, in Illinois, for example. But it culminated in the 19th Amendment, which is 100 years old this year. But African Americans played a role in broadening the context of American democracy. Fast forward to the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s opened the door for white women to move to the mainstream of the American economy, the politics, and the culture. Some scholars argue that they were the chief beneficiaries over the long haul of the fruits of the modern Black freedom movement. So Black people's struggles broadened the base of American democracy. I promised I would do only about 45 minutes. That is what you mandated. I'm going to try to bring it to a close, but I do want to identify the other themes. So we've got a lot of things working, right? Black people creating wealth. One, Black people creating wealth under duress. Two, with Black people working for themselves, Lord, building their own metropolis. Okay, but that metropolis was not just to sustain their cultural life and institution. It was a political process designed to dismantle institutions of inequality, slavery, and Jim Crow. And then we got this theme that Black freedom struggles enable all kinds of people to experience American democracy in ways that they hadn't before these movements. But there's another theme. In each case, when Black liberation movements ended slavery and later Jim Crow, they also faced swift and violent grassroots white resistance to change. Lynching, disfranchisement, sharecropping, and the rise of the white supremacist Jim Crow system followed the emancipation of some 4 million people of African descent. Following the triumph of the modern Black freedom struggle in recent times, grassroots opposition to the equal opportunity regime intensified. Affirmative action became a target that grassroots white movements tried to eliminate. I can't talk about all of this, but one of the pillars of this movement to undermine affirmative action, well, let's just say a couple of the pillars of this occurred in California. Proposition 209, known as the California Civil Rights Initiative. It was passed in 1996, and it was designed to completely dismantle the state's affirmative action programs for minorities and women. Okay, getting close. So how can I bring this to a sort of a conclusion? I have to say something about the recent period, because what I've done so far is to talk about the way this book engaged the pre-industrial era and the industrial era. And so this theme about each progressive movement being followed by a resistance movement is important, you know. And the 20th century sort of emergence of this, what I call the new equal opportunity regime. Once Jim Crow was destroyed, demolished, I argue that there was a new equal opportunity regime that was put into place. The country for a while embraced the ideal that it had to rectify its racist past and to provide African Americans with an opportunity for equity in American society. And that's why affirmative action was so important. The US Supreme Court sanctioned the idea of color conscious decision designed to eradicate all of these earlier forms of inequality. But by the late 20th century, the reaction against these movements had set in. And so, Jessica, if you just give me about 5 or 10 minutes, I will make a statement about this recent period. Okay. Oh, and by the way, it was not just grassroots white opposition to affirmative action that helped to diminish the impact of the modern Black freedom movement. It was also the deindustrialization of the American economy. So that by the late 20th century, the industrial economy started to dissipate and nearly disappear. Okay, so here's what I'm going to say. We are now in what we might call a new digital age that followed the modern Black freedom movement or followed the era of Jim Crow. But this digital age is also part of an age that has been called, and I think is a powerful description, that this is the era of the new Jim Crow and massive incarceration of Black people, violent policing. And so we're in a different place. So against the backdrop of all these changes of the late 20th and early 20th century, African people or people of African descent have moved into the digital age. And so what does that mean? What does that mean? How does it compare to the industrial age? How does it compare to the pre-industrial age? At the turn of the new millennium, the largest category of work for white men was salaried managers and administrators. For Black men, the average job or category was truck driving. For white women, the average job, secretary. For Black women, nurses aides, and orderlies. As we now know, this new digital age economy placed Black men and women in the eye of the storm of COVID-19 as health and other service providers. So in other words, during the pre-industrial period, the industrial era, and now the digital age, Black people are taking jobs at the bottom of the economy, and they are contributing to the development, wealth, and development of the nation against the odds. So the theme is run straight through from the beginning to the most recent period in African American history. But that is not all. I have one more statement to make. The pre-industrial era produced the abolitionist movement. The industrial era produced the modern Black freedom movement, the civil rights and Black power movements. The digital age is producing the Black Lives Matter movement. In 1913, following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of unarmed Trayvon Martin, activists launched the Black Lives Matter movement. Founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza and others, used new internet technology to ignite street level protests against police brutality from coast to coast. Under the impact of the 2016 presidential election, many Black Lives Matter activists called for greater engagement in the established electoral system, as well as grassroots protests and marches. Garza reported that the organization was doing a lot of work. The movement was doing a lot of work to build bridges between other movements and communities caught in the crosshairs of Trump's agenda. It's a real opportunity to build a movement of movements. Our futures are tied to each other. Garza, an organizer for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, formed in 2007, also suggested that labor organizing would remain one strategy for the contemporary social justice agenda. Today, many labor activists, white and black, see the organization of African Americans as the most promising prospect for rebuilding a vibrant US labor movement in the 21st century, as well as a vibrant anti-racist movement to eliminate contemporary systemic racism. I want to conclude with some other words, but I'm going to stop there because I think that we can let the Q&A carry some of the weight. So thank you for bearing with me through that whole scenario. I'm done. I'll do some more summarizing when we have our discussion, but I want to open it up so people can get a chance to engage.
Thank you so much, Dr. Trotter. This is a wonderful conversation. Our first question asks, do you believe that Black people in America can obtain the type of self-sustaining economy that you mentioned from years past, like in Sweet Auburn or in Tulsa? And if so, how?
If they can gain what? Just repeat the last point.
The same type of self-sustaining economy, like the Black business districts.
Okay, yeah. That's a good question, and it's a daunting question, to tell the truth. Today's global economy put a lot of Black businesses were small businesses, community-based businesses. And I think that we have to struggle to try, but the investment opportunities and the capital for doing the kind of business that will sustain itself over many years, that's a difficult proposition. But I also have to disclose that the way capitalism works precludes a lot of sustainable business development over a long period of time. And because the state responds so much better to capital than it does to poor and working class people who have few resources, it makes it more difficult for people to really amass the amount of capital they need to build sustainable businesses. That's why I think that, the politics of our nation, people who have progressive ideals about how to help small business people, working class people, poor people, have to play a role in sort of gaining control over the state and public policy so that you can put in place the kind of measures that are necessary to help people build communities. And so I would say that a lot of this, the answer to this question is contingent. If we're able, to gain the levels of power, we're able to get into policy making, decision making position, and can change the way the economy works, I think we have a better chance of those businesses developing.
Okay, looks like we have another one here. How do you think the phrase defunding the police helps or hinders the needed policies to address the systemic changes needed to improve police accountability and community trust?
This is a good question, and it speaks to what's going on now. And I am at the mercy of listening to a lot of other people on this on this question, but I absolutely believe that moving resources away from bloated police departments into social service activities and funding social service programs to aid Black communities is a worthwhile project to undertake. Um, Police departments are going to be around for a long time. We know that. Black people also, I think we have to keep in mind, have been very, very critical of being over policed and under protected. Black people will call police in cases where they feel they need help. And so we have to, we have to move forward to think about how communities can control more of the behavior that police have within their communities. But the ideal of, defunding, I think, is a good idea if it means moving resources around. But then there's another part that says, how can you balance all of this with the needs of communities for protection?
Definitely.
I'll be happy to hear other people who can chime in, right? You have the capacity to let other people speak.
I don't know if I do. If someone wants to speak, I think we'll figure out how to do that.
Or they can do the chat. Okay, I understand. Okay.
All right, we have another, let's see here. The question says, the approach that Black Lives Matter movement takes as a nonviolent movement, can Black lives actually matter? I'm not entirely sure. So as a nonviolent movement for Black Lives Matter, is that somehow challenging their statement on how Black lives should matter?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure I'm understanding that question properly.
I think it may have, the person can send you.
Rephrase your question.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. From your perspective as a historian, how do we sustainably address white supremacy backlash against the current glimmers of interracial progress?
I think this is this is a question I do think about a lot, and I think building viable interracial alliances is very important in countering white supremacist thinking. And I think that movements have to be very careful and diligent in going about making sure that they can identify those places where white people can be mobilized to support these non-racist, racist movements. And that has been the case all along. In a way, in my summary, I didn't talk a lot about the interracial cooperation that takes place in Black social movement. That's a theme of the book, by the way, you guys. That this is a theme of the book. Every movement that I've talked about in terms of Black people taking the lead and being out there taking the risk, in all of those movements, the book highlights how white allies, dependable white allies, although few in numbers, were also very critical to the success of these movements. And so that, I think, is the way to go in order to gain, some traction on this anti-racist movement and to have some success.
And when you look at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, that was an interracial movement. There
Yeah.
were people there from labor unions, particularly, that were very supportive of the work as well. So it is
Yes.
important to keep that in mind, definitely.
Yeah.
We had a bit of a rephrase here on the one question. So can Black Lives Matter using only nonviolent methods?
Well, I like to say that movements should be as nonviolent as they possibly can for as long as they can. And even then, the chances of carrying out a violent revolution is serious business. And movements like Black Lives Matter, very vulnerable to one of the most lethal military machines in the world. And so you don't want to, push people into a position where they feel that they can challenge this military might. That's why I think that in the end, Martin Luther King had so much going in his favor, is that he was trying to keep Black people alive and white allies alive. And the truth is, there is no telling how many people would have died had at least Martin Luther King come out and supported a movement that armed people. Early on in Martin Luther King's life, he actually, after his house was bombed, he actually went to the Birmingham police, Birmingham or Montgomery. I'm forgetting exactly what city at that time, but he went to the police department and he asked for permission to carry a gun. They denied him the right to carry a gun, which they couldn't do legally, but they denied him the right to carry a gun. And he went back and later wrote about praying over this particular decision. And he believed that that decision to bear arms himself was the wrong decision. And then he said, we are going to be nonviolent, you know, uh, in practice. So yeah, so I think that that's what I would say. You have to be very, very, very cautious and deliberate about how and when. Nobody wants to kill people. You want to be deliberate about when is necessary, that people have to take those desperate measures um, to bring about change. That doesn't mean that these desperate measures, that there is no point in history that these kind of measures will be taken, but as long as you can sustain this kind of movement. And so, yeah, so that's all I have to say there.
I think we have time for one more. We have three more in the queue here. So I'll read the three and you can choose which of the three you want to respond to. Okay, here. So why are the brief periods of gains made by Blacks always followed by longer periods of white reactions against those gains? So that's one option. Does defunding the police prevent them from shooting unarmed Black people? Would you kindly talk more on the relationship between finances and police with ethics and code of conduct toward Black people? And then the $50 million question or more, could you please reflect on the importance of reparations? Have scholars calculated the economic value of the labor stolen from African Americans since the first slaves were brought to what is now the US?
Wow, so those are good questions. Repeat the first one.
So why is this backlash always seem to be longer than the period where the gains were made?
Okay, all right. Those are all good questions. I think I'm gonna go with the reparation one. Okay. Um, I have always believed during my research on African American workers over the years that reparations for African American people, um, the foundation for it has been proven over and over. That there is a case, for some kind of reparation based on the way African Americans have been exploited, over the years and uncompensated labor. So I am definitely for some kind of reparations for African people. I'm just not sure how, all of this should be done, but I think the justice of it is there. And Workers on Arrival is really just another support document if people are trying to make a case for reparation. And the thing is you'll never know the magnitude of the profits that have been made off of the backs of Black labor, because they are so subtle, all kind of subtle ways in which these profits have been generated through the exploitation of Black labor. So I'm really supportive of this idea. And in fact, right now, there are some scholars who are really working hard on this and trying to really make it more concrete through all kinds of measures of getting a handle on this. But I think maybe in the end, reparations, they're actually going forward, going to enlist the minds and energy of people across all kinds of disciplines. Because when I think about the health question and COVID-19, and then looking back in history at the health toll that was taken on Black bodies over a long period of time, even as they were working to put wealth in the hands of their employers or owners. So yeah, so it's a complicated question, but it's one that I think future generations going to continue to wrestle with. At least we're moved out of that belittling stage. There was a long history of belittling 40 acres and a mule, belittling the ideal that Black people were looking to get reparation for their labor. But when you look at the Holocaust, all the other ethnic racial groups that have managed to make a case for themselves, then you begin to see the comparative term. There is justice that's involved in this question.
Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Trotter. We enjoyed speaking with you this evening. For those of you that are interested, we will be posting the full video of this talk on our Carter G. Woodson Center YouTube channel as soon as it is available. I would recommend following the Carter G. Woodson Center on social media so that you can see more of the cool stuff we're doing, including a video series that's tackling systemic racism right now. So please stay tuned for that. This is actually our last PACE speaker series of the fall. Our next event will be in the spring, where we'll be welcoming Peniel Joseph in March. So stay tuned for that information. And thank you all for attending this evening.
Okay, thank you.